This is going to be a wild ride through the sheer madness of medieval justice. A world where stealing bread could get you mutilated, bad jokes could lead to public humiliation, and the nobility always found extremely creative ways to ensure punishment looked more dramatic than necessary. You're about to step right into a time when crimes ranged from petty theft to outright treason, and the punishment almost always involved public spectacle, moral lessons, and way too many sharp objects. But before we dive into the horror, the absurdity, and the deeply questionable legal decisions of the medieval world, go ahead and subscribe, unless, of course, you want to risk ending up on the medieval chopping block yourself. Tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. So, settle in, close your eyes, and let's walk straight into the dark, messy, ridiculous world of medieval crimes and punishments. You're standing in the middle of a bustling medieval market. The air smells vaguely of spices, baked goods, and the unfortunate combination of unwashed peasants and suspiciously rotting fish. You aren't here to shop. You're here to observe, because today is punishment day, and nothing draws a crowd faster than a good old-fashioned public humiliation. The first thing you notice: the pillories. These weren't designed for comfort. They were built to ensure that anyone unlucky enough to be locked inside them was completely defenseless against the creative cruelty of medieval citizens. Someone has been accused of cheating in a market deal, perhaps shortchanging a noble, maybe lying about the quality of their cloth, and now they're stuck, hands and head locked in place, awaiting whatever the crowd feels is appropriate. And oh, the creativity. Someone throws rotten vegetables, because apparently, in medieval society, there was a constant, convenient supply of rotten vegetables, just waiting to be hurled at criminals. Another person shouts insults so specific it feels personal, while a bored-looking child casually smears something that is definitely unpleasant across the accused's hair. Lesson learned. Don't commit fraud in a medieval marketplace unless you enjoy being force-fed humiliation. But this is nothing compared to the real horror waiting just around the corner. Because not all crimes were forgivable. Some required blood, some required pain, and some required extremely over-the-top methods of teaching people why they should never repeat the mistake. And unfortunately for you, you're about to witness them all firsthand. The air grows heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and lingering sweat as the market square buzzes with a restless energy. You step forward carefully, your gaze drifting past the pillories, where unfortunate souls endure their public shame. Their faces streaked with rotten vegetable remnants and expressions of resigned misery. The crowd presses in closer now, anticipation curling in the air like the faintest trace of smoke before a fire erupts. Justice in medieval times wasn't simply about enforcing order. It was entertainment, spectacle, and a demonstration of power wrapped neatly in brutality. The movement shifts toward a wooden platform, and as you glance upward, you catch sight of the unmistakable figure of a town crier, a man whose sole purpose was to announce the misfortunes of others with an alarming enthusiasm. He raises his hands and begins the ritualistic proclamation, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade through flesh, declaring the crimes, the verdicts, and, most importantly, the punishments. The first case is a thief, a man accused of stealing a merchant's supply of grain. Theft in medieval Europe wasn't simply a matter of losing goods. It was seen as an attack on survival itself. Food meant life, and taking it without permission was akin to stealing the very breath from someone's lungs. The penalty: mutilation. A crowd erupts in jeers and gasps, some in mock outrage, others genuinely amused by the unfolding drama, as the condemned man is dragged toward the executioner, who awaits him with the unnervingly steady grip of someone who has performed this ritual countless times before. The tools are prepared, a crude blade, sharpened just enough to ensure that the act of severing fingers will be done with efficiency, rather than unnecessary hesitation. You watch as the thief struggles, his pleas drowning beneath the sea of laughter and insult, his protests reduced to meaningless noise against the iron grip of the law. His wrist is forced down against the block, his fingers spread apart like offerings to fate itself. And then, there is no ceremony, no hesitation. Only the unrelenting swing of the blade as it descends in an arc of cold precision. A sharp cry splits the air, followed by the wet thud of severed digits hitting the wooden surface like discarded scraps. The crowd erupts once more, some in horror, others in approval, the divide between outrage and amusement blurred in the chaos of medieval justice. Blood pools beneath the block, sliding between the cracks, mingling with the dust and filth that has long soaked into the town's foundation, marking yet another soul whose debt to society has been paid in flesh. The thief is hurried off, clutching his ruined hand, his future altered permanently in a matter of seconds. You barely have time to process what you have witnessed before the crier's voice rings out again, announcing the next judgment. This time, adultery. Adultery wasn't just a moral failing in medieval times. It was a disruption of lineage, a potential scandal capable of unraveling alliances, inheritance claims, and the fragile stability of noble bloodlines. While the severity of the punishment varied depending on the circumstances, public humiliation was often the favored method of correction. The condemned, a noblewoman accused of straying beyond the bounds of her marriage, is presented, her once immaculate gown now torn at the sleeves, dirt smeared against the fabric as a sign of her disgrace. Unlike the thief, who was subjected to immediate violence, she is instead led to a contraption designed for degradation. The cucking stool, a wooden seat suspended above a foul, smelling pit of water, meant to dunk the offender repeatedly until exhaustion stripped them of the last shreds of their dignity. The crowd surges forward as she is secured, strapped tightly so there is no chance of escape, her face drawn in tight defiance, even as she clenches her jaw against the inevitable. The mechanism creaks as the executioner operates the lever, pulling it back with deliberate slowness before releasing it abruptly, sending the woman plunging into the water below. A splash erupts, followed by sputtering gasps as she fights for air, her body twisting against the restraints before she is hauled back upward, only for the cycle to begin again. The crowd howls its approval, the act of punishment morphing into crude entertainment, each dunk a reminder that justice was never about fairness. It was about power, control, and making an example out of those who dared to disrupt the fragile order of medieval society. You barely have time to compose yourself before the crier announces another verdict. Heresy. The mere mention of the word sends a wave of murmurs through the crowd. Because heresy wasn't simply a crime. It was a challenge to the very foundation of faith, the unshakable structure upon which entire kingdoms were built. To be accused of heresy was to stand against God himself in the eyes of medieval Europe, and the punishment had to reflect the gravity of that transgression. The accused, an elderly man, his robes singed with soot, his eyes wild with desperation, is shoved forward, his cries of innocence drowned beneath the weight of holy judgment. The sentence: burning. Fire had long been the favored method of purging sin, the flames consuming not just the body, but the supposed corruption that lay within. A pyre has already been constructed in the square, the wood stacked high dry, eager to fulfill its grim purpose. The condemned is tied to the stake, his wrists bound, his expression shifting from defiance to sheer panic as the first torch is lit. The fire begins slowly, a creeping hunger licking at the edges of the wood, feeding upon the air, growing, expanding, claiming its victim inch by inch. At first, there is only heat, unbearable, suffocating. But then come the flames, curling up against flesh, blackening fabric, devouring every fibre of the man's being as he screams. The crowd watches, some silent, others cheering. Their faces illuminated by the flickering inferno, an audience witnessing justice in its most raw, unforgiving form. The executioners stand motionless, their duty complete, their hands steady as they observe the final moments of the condemned, their expressions unreadable, their thoughts unknowable. The fire roars, the scent of burning hair and flesh mingling with the air, filling lungs, embedding itself into memory, ensuring that the lesson is understood. Heresy is not tolerated, and the price of defiance is absolute. The man's cries fade, lost beneath the crackling of the flames, until there is nothing left but embers, smoke curling upward, carrying the remnants of judgment into the heavens. The crowd begins to disperse, their entertainment concluded, their satisfaction met. You turn, stepping away from the square, your thoughts heavy, your pulse steady, the weight of medieval justice pressing down upon you as you navigate the streets once more. But the day is not yet over, and punishment is far from finished. Justice has no patience for rest. It only demands more victims, more blood, more lessons to be learned. And as you walk forward, the stories of crime and consequence unfold around you, waiting to be witnessed, waiting to be told. You push forward, past the lingering scent of charred flesh and the murmurs of departing spectators. Your step steady, but your thoughts tangled in the weight of what you've witnessed. The market square, though still alive with activity, feels different now, less like a place of commerce, and more like a stage upon which justice unfolds with a terrifying consistency. The air hums with an unspoken tension, and as you weave through narrow streets, the echoes of past punishment settle into the very stones beneath your feet. You barely make it half a block before another commotion stirs the crowd. A fresh sentence, a new lesson to be taught, and a reminder that the medieval world does not rest when it comes to enforcing its laws. This time, the accused is a beggar, an unfortunate soul caught in the crime of vagrancy. It may seem trivial to you, perhaps even unjust, but in the rigid hierarchy of medieval society, poverty was not just misfortune. It was often seen as a choice, a flaw, a disruption of order that could not go unchecked. There was no sympathy, no understanding of circumstance. Only the cold hand of the law sweeping across the weak as efficiently as it did the powerful. He is dragged to the center of the square, arms bound tightly with rope, his protests meaningless against the rhythmic chanting of the assembled crowd. A charge of vagrancy meant punishment in the form of branding, a hot iron pressed against flesh, marking the condemned with a symbol that would ensure he was forever recognized as undesirable, a warning to others that his presence would never again be welcome among respectable citizens. The executioner, a man whose hands are as steady as his apathy, pulls a small iron rod from the glowing embers, its tip shimmering with heat, eager to fulfill its grim purpose. The beggar thrashes, a desperate attempt to escape his fate, but there is no mercy for those deemed a disruption to order. The iron is pressed against the exposed flesh of his forearm, the hiss of burning skin swallowed by his strangled cries. The brand is simple, an unmistakable mark that announces his status to any who cross his path. It is not just pain. It is a sentence that follows him beyond this day, beyond this crowd, beyond this square, ensuring that survival will be even harder than it was before. And yet, the spectacle continues, as if the air itself demands another display of suffering before the sun sets. A new case is announced. Counterfeiting. This, unlike vagrancy, is a crime taken seriously by even the highest ranks of society. For false currency threatens not just individuals but entire economies, disrupting trade, weakening trust, and undermining the foundation upon which medieval commerce is built. The accused, a former merchant whose ambition led him to produce fraudulent coin, stands before the gathered masses, his hands trembling, his face drained of color as he listens to the sentence being read aloud. Counterfeiting is an insult to the nobility, a direct assault on the integrity of wealth, and the punishment must reflect the severity of the crime. Death. There is no hesitation in the verdict, no moment of consideration. For the law is clear. Those who challenge the monetary system must be erased from it entirely. The gallows await. The wooden structure looming with quiet authority, its rope swaying gently in the afternoon breeze like a silent promise of what is to come. The merchant is led to the platform, his feet dragging against the ground, every step forcing him closer to inevitability. The executioner adjusts the rope, ensuring that it is secured properly, his movements precise, practiced, detached from the gravity of the moment. There is a final plea, barely above a whisper, but it is lost in the shuffle, drowned beneath the weight of justice, swallowed by the unfeeling march toward conclusion. A sharp pull, a sudden drop, and it is over. The body swings lazily, the merchant no longer part of the economy he sought to manipulate. You inhale slowly, steadying yourself against the whirlwind of brutality, pushing away the thought that even the smallest mistake could mean an end just as swift, just as final. And yet, as unsettling as it may seem, none of this is unusual. None of it shocks those who live among it. None of it feels out of place in a world that demands order above all else. Justice does not sleep, and neither does the hunger for control. You keep walking, because there is always another case waiting to be heard, another punishment waiting to be delivered, another life waiting to be reshaped by law and spectacle alike. And tonight, as the stars creep into view, and the streets fall into uneasy silence, there will be those who reflect on the day's events, not in horror, not in protest, but in acceptance. For in the medieval world, punishment is not questioned, it simply is. And tomorrow, there will be more. The streets grow quieter as the crowd disperses, the day's punishments having left their mark on the marketplace in streaks of blood, discarded rags, and the lingering smell of burnt flesh. The spectacle has ended, but justice in the medieval world never truly sleeps. It only waits for the next soul to step into its iron grip. You push forward, past the last remnants of the day's executions, through narrow corridors of stone, where the whispers of courtroom trials carry heavier than the weight of any sword. And soon, the air thickens with the scent of damp parchment, ink-stained records, and the unmistakable chill of political scheming, disguised as religious authority. Because here, in the heart of medieval power, heretics don't just disappear, they are meticulously dismantled, one accusation at a time. Joan of Arc's trial was never just about justice or even faith. It was about control, power, and ensuring that the voice of one stubborn teenager didn't unravel the delicate balance of European politics. She wasn't just a warrior. She was a symbol, a threat, a force too unpredictable for the French nobility or the English occupiers to leave unchecked. And when someone threatens the status quo in medieval Europe, they are swiftly reminded that God, and more importantly, the powerful men who claim to speak on his behalf, will not tolerate rebellion. So, Joan stood not before an honest court, but before a jury that had already written her fate in ink before she had even spoken a word. Rouen, France, a city under English control, ensuring that the trial wasn't about fairness, but about making sure Joan's legacy was snuffed out before it could cause any further damage. The accusations weren't crafted carefully. They were thrown at her like a fistful of mud, hoping something stuck. Heresy, witchcraft, dressing like a man, claiming to hear voices. And, just in case none of those seemed quite damning enough, there was the ever-reliable charge of disobeying the church, because if all else fails, nothing guarantees an execution more than questioning religious authority in the Middle Ages. Joan, as reckless as she was righteous, didn't cower in fear, didn't plead for mercy, because mercy was never going to be an option. Instead, she fought back with logic, arguing that she had only followed the will of God, not the twisted politics of corrupt clergy or scheming nobles. And, of course, the court couldn't allow that answer to stand. Days turned into weeks of questioning, psychological pressure, and enough theological debates to make even the most educated bishop sweat under his robes. Joan was trapped, forced to defend herself against accusations designed to condemn her no matter how she responded. They demanded she swear allegiance to the church, knowing full well that their version of the church was twisted into something more political than divine. They accused her of witchcraft, yet failed to produce even the slightest evidence beyond the fact that she had the audacity to win battles while wearing armor instead of dresses. But medieval trials were never about evidence. They were about outcomes. And Joan's outcome was written long before the first gavel ever struck wood. Because even when she tried to recant, even when she attempted to maneuver her way around the court's demands, it was too late. Her existence was a problem, and the solution, fire. Burning at the stake had always been the church's preferred method of making sure heretics didn't leave behind inconvenient corpses for people to rally around. Flames erased everything: sins, identities, and most importantly, the possibility of resurrection in the political arena. Joan of Arc, the girl who had led armies, defied kings, and stood against accusations with stubborn defiance, was dragged to the pyre, tied in place, forced to stare down the final punishment of her short, disastrous, glorious existence. There was no glorious rescue, no last-minute intervention, no hidden allies waiting in the shadows. Joan, betrayed by the very country she fought to save, met death exactly as the court had planned. Wrapped in flame, swallowed by smoke, and reduced to ash before the sun set. The spectacle was meant to be a warning, a reminder to anyone who might consider rebellion, a brutal lesson in the consequences of standing against the delicate fabric of medieval power. But history, as always, had other plans. Because Joan didn't fade into obscurity. She became a martyr, a legend, a figure so powerful that centuries later, she would be canonized as a saint. The trial that was meant to erase her only ensured her immortality. And so, the embers of her execution smoldered, long after the fire had gone out, burning not through the streets of Rouen, but through the pages of history, ensuring that medieval justice, in all its brutal absurdity, had once again failed to silence the one voice it feared most. William Wallace wasn't just a warrior, a rebel, or a thorn in the side of the English monarchy. He was an absolute nightmare for England's attempt at total domination. A man who somehow survived long enough to make an entire empire question why it hadn't killed him sooner. But, as all medieval defiance stories go, the crown eventually got tired of his nonsense. And the moment they finally dragged him into custody, they made sure his execution was the worst kind of theatrical horror imaginable. Picture it. London, 1305, a city bustling with merchants, thieves, royals who probably smelled faintly of lavender and entitlement, and an audience gathering with morbid excitement, because today was going to be a show. William Wallace, the infamous Scottish rebel, dragged through the streets, chained, broken, exhausted, probably wondering why medieval punishment never had a mild inconvenience option instead of absolute blood-soaked carnage. But this wasn't just a death sentence. This was medieval authorities making absolutely sure that nobody ever dared to challenge England's rule again. His crime, being way too successful at making the English monarchy deeply regret its decisions. His punishment, being hanged, drawn, and quartered. A process so unnecessarily graphic that even hardened medieval executioners probably took a deep breath before going through with it. First, the hanging, because medieval justice was not the kind to just get things over with quickly. Wallace wasn't given a clean drop like a standard execution. Oh no, that would be merciful. Instead, they strangled him halfway, letting his body thrash, and struggled just enough to make sure he knew what was coming next, before cutting him down while he was still alive. Because why let someone die once when you can make them experience it in installments? Next, the drawing. A term that sounds deceptively simple, but is actually one of the worst things imaginable. Wallace was tied down, sliced open like an over-enthusiastic butcher demonstrating technique, and had his intestines pulled out, while the crowd watched in gleeful anticipation. And the best part, he was still alive at this point. Because if there's one thing medieval punishment was exceptionally good at, it was making sure people lived just long enough to suffer properly. And finally, the quartering, because apparently there was still more to do after casually ruining someone's entire body in every way possible. His limbs were hacked off, one by one, ensuring that there was exactly nothing left of him intact, with the final piece being his head, detached, preserved, and displayed proudly on a spike, because England wanted to make absolutely sure that Scotland got the message loud and clear. As for the limbs, they were scattered to different parts of the country, because when medieval leaders made examples out of people, they went for full geographical coverage. But here's the thing. William Wallace's execution wasn't the end of his story. Sure, his physical existence was reduced to several unfortunate pieces, but his legacy didn't die with him. Instead, he became a symbol, an undying rebellion, a name that Scotland would never let fade into quiet defeat. And medieval punishment, despite its grotesque commitment to erasing people entirely, often had the opposite effect. Because nothing fuels legend quite like a gruesome, deeply excessive execution that makes history itself wince. Now, justice wasn't done handing out misfortune yet, and another poor soul was about to step into its merciless grip. Let's keep walking. There's another crime waiting, and medieval law still has a few more horrors left to reveal. The smell of scorched flesh from past executions still lingers in the air, mixing with the damp musk of medieval streets. A reminder that justice in this world is less about fairness and more about making a statement, loud enough for even the most defiant to hear. The flickering remnants of William Wallace's grim fate have barely faded before another figure is thrust forward into history's unforgiving grip. Jan Hus, a man who, in retrospect, probably should have kept his opinions about religious reform to himself if he wanted to keep all his body parts intact. But alas, this was the Middle Ages, a time when questioning the church was basically the equivalent of standing in a lightning storm while holding a metal rod and shouting, "Come at me, nature!" Huss, a priest with entirely too many radical ideas for the liking of the Catholic authorities, had spent years preaching annoyingly reasonable things, like the belief that religious leaders shouldn't be drowning in wealth while peasants suffered, that maybe scripture should be available to people in a language they actually understood, and that indulgences, the church's brilliant money-making scheme where people could pay to reduce their sins, were basically divine tax fraud. Naturally, none of this went over well with those enjoying said wealth, and it wasn't long before Huss was branded with that ever dangerous accusation, heresy. Heresy, of course, was not the kind of charge you walked away from with a light fine or a slap on the wrist. No, heresy meant an elaborate, slow, burning spectacle designed to teach everyone in a 3-mile radius exactly what happened to people with loud opinions that contradicted official doctrine. The moment Huss was called to the Council of Constance in 1415, it was clear this wasn't going to end with a reasonable debate over theological differences. The trial itself was more of a theatrical production than a legal proceeding, the kind where the verdict had already been decided before the accused even stepped into the room. Huss, ever the optimist, thought he had been summoned to defend his beliefs, to have a logical discussion about reform. The church, however, had other plans, which mostly involved ensuring he left the premises as a smouldering pile of ashes, rather than an active participant in ongoing religious conversations. A trial was more of an interrogation, peppered with enough pressure and threats to make even the most confident man rethink his life choices. The accusations were grand, sweeping and designed to paint Huss as not just a dissenter, but a direct threat to the very foundations of Christianity itself. Did he try to recant? Not really. Did he attempt a diplomatic escape route? Also no, because Huss, unlike many unfortunate souls caught in medieval legal disasters, truly believed in everything he preached, right up until the moment someone set him on fire for it. He refused to abandon his ideas, refused to beg for mercy, because medieval trials loved dramatic flair, refused to acknowledge the authority of those judging him. Of course, that sealed his fate. The sentencing was swift, brutal, and entirely predictable, burning at the stake. Not a quick beheading, not exile, not even an extended imprisonment where he might eventually rot into irrelevance. No, he had to burn, because fire was the preferred method of making sure a person's heresy was well and truly purged. The pyre was prepared with an enthusiasm that suggested the executioners had done this far too many times before. Wood was stacked high, positioned with precision to ensure the flames climbed efficiently, enveloping every inch of the condemned without unnecessary delay. Huss, bound and gagged, was dragged toward the waiting inferno, the crowd swelling with anticipation, because nothing drew spectators faster than a good heretic roast. And here's the thing about medieval executions. They weren't meant to be quick, because suffering was half the point. A slow burn ensured maximum effect, a gradual tightening of smoke around the lungs, a searing agony that served as both punishment and cautionary tale. The fire took its time, licking at fabric before curling hungrily around flesh, blackening, twisting, consuming. Huss screamed, because that was inevitable, but his voice wasn't just pain, it was defiance. His last words, muffled by flame and smoke, carried the remnants of the battle he had fought. Words of faith, words of conviction, words that refuse to crumble even under the weight of execution. And just like that, he was gone, swallowed by the fire, reduced to ashes. Another victim of religious paranoia, another name burned into the ledger of medieval cruelty. Did his execution stop his ideas from spreading? Absolutely not. If anything, Huss's death only ensured that the Reformation would brew even harder in the years to come, with later reformers citing his name as proof that the church needed to change, or, at the very least, reconsider its habit of setting people on fire for speaking their minds. The fires that consumed Jan Hus have barely finished smouldering before another grim facet of medieval justice reveals itself. One where punishment is less about erasing ideological dissent and more about ensuring that even the pettiest infractions are met with unrelenting brutality. Because if there's one thing medieval lawmakers excelled at, it was turning everyday mistakes into executions. And few systems embodied this excessive cruelty quite like the early roots of the Bloody Code in England. A set of laws so wildly disproportionate in punishment that you could be sentenced to death for something as trivial as stealing a loaf of bread. Imagine the scene: a crowded medieval town, merchants shouting over one another to sell overpriced fabric, suspiciously watered, down aisle, and vegetables that probably should have been thrown out weeks ago. You pass a baker's stall, the scent of warm bread filling the air, a temptation far too strong for someone who hasn't eaten in days and has no coins to their name. It seems simple enough: a quick snatch, a dash into the maze of alleyways, and you'll live to see another day. But, of course, medieval justice does not forgive hungry thieves. No, medieval justice has been designed specifically to make sure that even the smallest crimes receive theatrical, horrifying punishments. Because here's the thing: the early Bloody Code didn't believe in warnings, fines, or mild inconveniences for minor offences. No, the authorities wanted the world to understand that crime, even the most insignificant kind, was a direct insult to the fragile balance of law and order. Petty theft, poaching, begging, cutting down a neighbor's tree without permission, and yes, stealing bread, all had the same potential punishment: death. Not imprisonment, not exile, death. You barely have time to process the reality of it before the thief is caught, a swarm of merchants descending upon them with righteous fury, shouting accusations loud enough to alert the nearest town guard. The guilty party struggles, not because they thought they could escape, but because human instinct refuses to accept that stealing something so small could lead to an execution. But the law does not care for common sense. It only cares for precedent. The sentencing is swift. Public hanging. The gallows stand proudly in the town square. Weather, worn wood. Thick rope swaying slightly in the breeze. Waiting, always waiting, for the next victim of a law system that operates with all the subtlety of an axe, falling onto an unsuspecting neck. The condemned is dragged to the platform, still protesting, still refusing to believe that bread could possibly warrant a death sentence. But the crowd has seen this story unfold too many times before to entertain such disbelief. The executioner prepares the rope, the town's officials standing solemnly, not because they particularly care, but because justice is best served with a carefully practiced air of indifference. A final breath, a final plea, ignored entirely, because once the sentence is passed, there is no going back. And then the drop, swift, brutal, entirely unnecessary, but exactly what the law demands. The crowd barely reacts, perhaps slightly entertained, slightly disappointed that there wasn't more struggling, more drama, more proof that crime leads directly to suffering. The merchant who was wronged returns to their stall, satisfied that the legal system has upheld their property rights with all the grace of a sledgehammer to the face, while the executioner adjusts the rope, ensuring it's ready for whoever comes next. Because there is always someone next. Maybe another thief, perhaps a poacher who dared take a rabbit from royal land, or a beggar who asked for coins one too many times. The law, in its endless hunger for punishment, does not discriminate. It only demands obedience. And England, under the early Bloody Code, ensured that obedience was never optional. Because in medieval England, you didn't just die for treason. You died for being inconvenient to the system. And history remembers that, even if the condemned never got the chance to. The medieval world was not subtle when it came to crime and punishment. It was loud, dramatic, and always ready to turn every situation into an absolute mess of blood, scandal, and deeply questionable decisions made by people who had entirely too much power. Few incidents embodied this chaos better than the assassination of Thomas Becket in 1170, a crime so reckless, so outrageously disastrous, that even the king who was partly responsible ended up doing barefoot penance in the streets afterward. It all started with King Henry CA, a man who, like many rulers before and after him, had a deeply unhealthy relationship with his temper. Henry and Becket were once great friends, the kind who probably drank too much together and plotted grand ideas for England, while laughing over some questionable medieval entertainment. But friendship in politics is about as stable as a castle built on wet bread. And soon enough, Becket, who had become Archbishop of Canterbury, started taking his religious duties a little too seriously for Henry's liking. The king, as kings tend to be, was absolutely convinced he had supreme authority over everything. But Becket, being one of those rare people who actually thought church and state should be separate things, refused to let Henry boss him around in matters of religion. This was an immediate problem, because nothing irritated a medieval king more than someone telling him he wasn't the ultimate authority in literally everything. The tension between them boiled over into full-blown feuding, and by feuding, we mean Henry basically spent every waking moment ranting about Becket and how much he was ruining England. And then, one fateful evening, in a moment of peak frustration, Henry uttered what might be the worst mistake of his entire reign. The infamous words, or at least some version of them, were, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" A sentence that, at first glance, could mean he just wanted Becket to stop annoying him, but to the eager knights in his court, it meant murder time. You see, medieval knights weren't exactly known for thinking things through before acting, and Henry's words, whether intended as an order or just an angry outburst, were taken as a direct command, without much hesitation. Probably way too little hesitation. Honestly, 4 knights marched straight to Canterbury Cathedral and did exactly what Henry had sort of, but maybe not really implied they should do. There was no dramatic showdown, no carefully orchestrated assassination plan. Just 4 very determined knights, bursting into the church like drunken troublemakers, chasing down Becket, and butchering him right in front of the altar. Swords were drawn, heads were cracked open, and holy spaces were absolutely disregarded. Because why stop at simple murder when you can also insult every major religious institution at the same time? The deed was done. Blood soaked the cathedral floors, and suddenly, every single one of those knights realized they had possibly made the worst career decision of their lives. Meanwhile, back in Henry's castle, the news reached the king's ears. And if panic could have a physical form, it would have been Henry sprinting back and forth, realizing he had just accidentally committed history's worst case of murder by miscommunication. He had wanted Becket gone, sure, but not in a brutally hacked to death in the middle of a sacred church kind of way. England, France, Rome. Everyone lost their collective minds at the audacity of assassinating an archbishop inside a cathedral, because if there was one rule medieval society agreed on, it was, maybe don't murder priests in their own churches. Henry, already regretting everything, needed a way to convince the world that he hadn't meant for this to happen. Preferably one that didn't involve losing his throne or getting excommunicated on the spot. Enter one of the most humiliating acts of royal apology ever recorded: barefoot public penance. Yes, the King of England, arguably one of the most powerful rulers in Europe at the time, walked barefoot through the streets while getting whipped by monks. Because when you mess up in medieval politics, the only way to fix it is apparently public displays of deep regret combined with mild self-inflicted suffering. Henry prostrated himself before Becket's shrine, allowed monks to lash him like a particularly dramatic sinner trying to make up for lost time, and essentially threw himself into the greatest pity performance of the century. All while absolutely hating every second of it, but knowing he had no other choice. Did it work? Mostly. The church didn't excommunicate him. Becket was promptly declared a martyr, and eventually a saint, and Henry, though forever haunted by the absolute disaster of his decisions, managed to keep his crown. But Becket's assassination became one of the most infamous crimes in European history. A reminder that maybe kings should consider their words carefully before speaking, especially if they have a lot of aggressively enthusiastic knights hanging around. The murder of Thomas Becket wasn't just a crime. It was a spectacular failure of communication, politics, and general common sense. Wrapped neatly in a blood-soaked cathedral, and topped with one of the most awkward royal apologies ever performed in public. And if anything, it proved one thing above all else: never complain too loudly about someone unless you're prepared to do barefoot penance for it afterward. Edward Sickham wasn't exactly known for competent leadership. His reign was a disaster of poor decisions, favoritism, and an almost impressive ability to annoy literally everyone who mattered in medieval politics. He had favorites, men who held too much influence, made too many enemies, and eventually paid the price for their loyalty in ways that made medieval punishment look especially creative in its brutality. Among them was Hugh Despenser, a man who went from trusted royal advisor to human cautionary tale, proving that when nobles decide they don't like you anymore, they don't just kick you out of court, they make sure you leave in as many pieces as possible. Now, Edward's reign was falling apart faster than a badly constructed peasant hut, and by the time his wife, Queen Isabella, and her very ambitious companion, Roger Mortimer, took control, treason trials became less about law and more about clearing the board of inconvenient people. Hugh Despenser, who had spent years hoarding power, wealth, and making sure no one could challenge his grip on Edward's court, was suddenly the most hated man in England, and the nobles wasted absolutely no time making sure his downfall was more dramatic than an overacted stage play. The charges: treason, theft, corruption, general villainy, and being insufferably arrogant, all probably true, but also not entirely based on legal evidence. So much as we don't like him, please remove him from existence. The punishment. Oh, it was a masterpiece of medieval horror. Despenser's execution was not a simple beheading. Because why cut off someone's head quickly when you can make an entire event out of it? No. He was sentenced to hanging, drawing, and quartering, a punishment so unnecessarily elaborate that executioners practically needed a checklist to get through it properly. First, the humiliation parade. Because public punishment had to start with dragging the condemned through the streets, making sure everyone got a good look and had plenty of time to throw things and scream insults. Dispenser, stripped and forced to ride backward on a mangy old horse, was pelted with filth, mocked, and generally reminded that he had made far too many enemies to expect even a shred of mercy. Then came the hanging, but in true medieval fashion, it wasn't meant to kill him outright, just make him deeply regret his life choices while dangling half conscious. He was strangled, briefly, just enough to make breathing difficult, but not impossible, because medieval torture had a very specific way of ensuring that death was stretched out as long as possible. Next, the drawing, meaning his intestines were pulled out while he was still very much alive. And as if that wasn't bad enough, his manhood was also removed, because treason and personal humiliation went hand in hand in medieval executions. Finally, the quartering. Because no execution in this era was truly complete without making sure the body was divided into multiple pieces and sent to various corners of the kingdom. His limbs were hacked off, packaged up like morbid souvenirs, and displayed for everyone to see, just in case anyone had lingering doubts about what happens when you get too comfortable abusing royal power. Edward Tyr, meanwhile, didn't last much longer after Despenser's execution. He was imprisoned, deposed, and possibly murdered under extremely suspicious circumstances, ensuring that his reign ended with just as much chaos as it had started. The treason trials that followed his downfall were less about proving actual crimes and more about making sure every trace of his rule was obliterated. And if that meant exceptionally gruesome executions, so be it. Medieval justice wasn't just about punishment. It was a warning, a spectacle, and an ongoing lesson in making sure no one forgot who was in charge. And Despenser, he became one of its most famous examples, not because he was innocent, but because his fate was so horrifying that history refused to forget it. The name Gilles de Rais should have been remembered for glorious things. A French nobleman, a war hero, one of Joan of Arc's most trusted allies during her legendary campaigns. But, of course, history had other plans, and instead of going down as one of France's great warriors, Gilles ended up making medieval crime significantly more horrifying, ensuring that his legacy was less about military victories and more about deeply unsettling accusations, an embarrassingly public trial, and a punishment so severe that even medieval justice, which was already unforgiving, had to take a moment to process it. Gilles de Rais was not accused of petty theft or mild treason, or even something as simple as getting on the wrong side of the monarchy. No, he was accused of murdering children, dabbling in dark magic, and generally making every possible bad life choice, all at once. And when medieval courts are presented with crimes that make even hardened executioners deeply uncomfortable, they ensure that the trial, an eventual execution, is nothing short of an absolute spectacle. The trouble started when Joan of Arc was gone, and Gilles was left without a purpose, something that rarely goes well when a man has wealth, power, and a concerning lack of impulse control. With no battle to fight, no noble cause to champion, and an alarming amount of free time, Gilles started making some truly questionable decisions, the kind that eventually lead to very concerned authorities showing up at your doorstep with a list of charges so long they need an extra sheet of parchment. The first whispers were unsettling. Strange disappearances, servants too frightened to speak, rumors about occult practices, because nothing says medieval disaster like someone deciding necromancy sounds like a fantastic hobby. But it wasn't just gossip. Soon, actual accusations began to surface, and suddenly Gilles was no longer just a disgraced noble, but someone the church and the courts were extremely interested in condemning publicly. The charges were extensive, ranging from murder, sacrilege, demonic rituals, general villainy, and probably being an overall unpleasant dinner guest. Because once medieval courts decide you're guilty, they don't hold back. Gilles had no real defense, mostly because when your crime list includes summoning demons and personally reducing the local population by entirely unacceptable numbers, convincing the court you're innocent is an uphill battle. And so the trial began, an affair so sensational that crowds gathered to hear every dreadful detail. Confessions were extracted, because torture was a completely acceptable part of medieval legal proceedings. Witnesses testified, and nobles who once fought alongside Gilles visibly regretted their association. He was accused of ritualistic murders, horrific cruelty, and generally being the worst possible person to ever exist inside a castle. Once the verdict was inevitably reached, the punishment had to match the sheer horror of the crimes. And medieval justice, always ready to dramatically erase someone from history, settled on death by hanging and burning, because when courts decide someone is just that evil, they make sure fire is involved. Gilles was led to his execution with about as much dignity as someone who had ruined their entire existence could muster. He confessed, repented, and then was promptly sent straight into the afterlife in flames and smoke. And thus, Gilles de Rais became a cautionary tale, proof that too much wealth, too much unchecked power, and a complete lack of moral restraint will absolutely end badly in medieval France. If anything, his story is a reminder that even medieval justice, which was already alarmingly severe, had its limits for what it could stomach. When you make medieval courts disgusted, you know you've officially committed too many crimes for one lifetime. Medieval financial crime was not just about lying on tax records or sneaking extra weight onto a merchant's scales. It was about physically altering the currency itself, a crime so infuriating to kings and governments that it was often punished with all the subtlety of a medieval war hammer. Coin clipping, the act of shaving off tiny slivers of precious metal from coins, seemed like a harmless enough scheme in the grand scheme of medieval theft. But the problem was it messed with the economy in ways that made rulers absolutely lose their minds. And when medieval rulers lost their minds over something, it meant extremely unfortunate punishments were about to happen. Picture it. A bustling medieval marketplace, people bartering, exchanging coins, merchants shouting aggressively in the background about their completely reasonable prices that were absolutely not inflated. And somewhere among all this commotion, a clever criminal carefully shaving the edges off silver and gold coins, pocketing the scrap metal like they've just discovered the medieval version of cryptocurrency mining. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. If you removed just enough metal from a lot of coins, you could melt down the clippings and sell them separately, while still spending the altered coins as if they were perfectly fine. The problem? Eventually, too many clipped coins flooded the market, and suddenly, everyone realized their money was shrinking without their consent. Authorities, predictably, were furious. Currency debasement was not just petty theft. It was an insult to the integrity of the kingdom's finances, and rulers did not tolerate insults to their wealth. To medieval leaders, coin clipping was essentially high treason, because a damaged economy meant weakened power, unhappy merchants, and far too many angry nobles complaining about their declining fortunes. And when treason was involved, punishment was never going to be simple or painless. The usual first step in catching coin clippers was inspection. Officials would measure and weigh coins carefully, looking for the telltale signs of altered edges, thinner profiles, and suspiciously lighter currency. Anyone caught with a large collection of suspiciously shaved coins or metal shavings that could not be reasonably explained was dragged in for questioning. And by questioning, we of course mean medieval interrogation methods that involved a lot of shouting, strong accusations, and potential limb-related regrets. Now, once guilt was established, punishment depended on how irritated the authorities were feeling that day. Sometimes, if the crime was relatively minor, coin clippers might be fined heavily, have their property confiscated, or, if they were lucky, just get thrown into prison for an uncomfortably long time. But for those who were considered major offenders, things escalated extremely fast. Mutilation was a common sentence, because medieval justice had a very strong belief in direct consequences matching the crime. If you clipped coins, then naturally, someone was going to clip pieces off you in return. Hands were cut off, fingers removed, or ears sliced, because apparently, medieval punishment had an unofficial rule about making sure criminals had permanent reminders of their mistakes. Execution, however, was reserved for the worst offenders, especially if they were caught doing it on a large scale or within royal circles. For those particularly unfortunate coin clippers, the punishment usually involved hanging, because once again, financial crime was treated like treason, and treason meant getting publicly removed from existence in front of an audience that had nothing better to do that day. And just to really hammer the lesson home, rulers made sure everyone was aware of the dangers of financial deception. Announcements, warnings, dramatic tales of criminals who were once wealthy, only to lose everything, including body parts, after their scheme fell apart. The message was clear: don't mess with the economy, or the economy will mess with you. Coin clipping might seem ridiculous compared to the grand crimes of murder, betrayal, and political scandal, but to medieval rulers, nothing was more insulting than messing with their money. And when a crime directly threatened the wealth of the nobility, punishment was guaranteed to be swift, brutal, and probably unnecessarily theatrical. Because if there's one thing medieval justice never ignored, it was anything that made the rich slightly less rich. Medieval justice may have been spectacularly cruel, but even in a world where stealing a loaf of bread could get you hanged, there was still one small loophole: sanctuary. It was not exactly a get-out of execution-free card, but for criminals who could reach a church before angry mobs or town guards got their hands on them. It was the one chance to delay an unpleasant fate, and maybe, just maybe, find an alternative to immediate death. Imagine this. You've just been caught committing a crime. Whether that's something minor like poaching a noble's deer or something significantly worse, like full-blown treason. You have two choices: stand trial and hope that medieval justice has randomly decided to be merciful today, unlikely, or sprint toward the nearest church and throw yourself at the mercy of sanctuary laws. Because once you were inside a church, things changed. Sanctuary laws stated that the church was holy ground, and even the most furious executioners couldn't drag someone out by force. Guards could wait outside, People could shout insults through the doors, but as long as a criminal stayed within those sacred walls, they had temporary protection. Now, sanctuary wasn't an indefinite solution. You couldn't just live in a church forever, like some kind of medieval squatter. There was a time limit, usually 40 days, and in that period, the criminal had to figure out their next move. Some pleaded for mercy. Others tried to negotiate exile rather than punishment, and a few probably pretended to be super devout in the hopes of convincing everyone they were very sorry and deserved forgiveness. But medieval justice was never easy, and after the sanctuary period was up, the criminal had to face reality. Banishment was the most common outcome. No trials, no formal sentencing, just a direct order to leave town and never come back. And because nothing in the Middle Ages was subtle, criminals were forced to walk barefoot, carrying a cross, signaling to everyone that they were officially kicked out of society. This was not a convenient exile. There was no guarantee of survival, because wandering without protection meant being easy prey for bandits, disease, starvation, or any number of unfortunate medieval disasters. Some managed to restart their lives elsewhere. Some got caught committing new crimes, and weren't lucky enough to reach sanctuary again. And others probably spent their last days regretting every questionable decision that had landed them in exile in the first place. Trial by ordeal was medieval justice at its absolute worst. A system so utterly detached from logic that if you so much as sneezed in the wrong direction, you might find yourself shoving your arm into a cauldron of boiling water, just to prove you weren't guilty of something ridiculous. Because before courts had judges, evidence, and at least some attempt at reasonable decision-making, medieval authorities relied on brutal tests that essentially boiled down to, let's see if God personally intervenes to save you. And as you might guess, God wasn't exactly known for stepping in on behalf of accused criminals during these trials, meaning most people ended up horribly injured or dead regardless of whether they were actually guilty. The three most common trials, by water, fire, and combat, all had their own deeply questionable logic behind them, with none of them remotely resembling fairness, rational thought, or even basic survival instincts. Because when medieval judges couldn't decide whether someone was guilty, instead of checking witnesses, documents, or common sense, they would say, "All right, let's throw this guy into a lake and see what happens." And that brings us to trial by water, a method so absurd that even the executioners probably had to suppress laughter while carrying it out. Trial by water involved tossing the accused into a body of water to see whether they sank or floated. Sounds simple. Oh, it was horrifically simple. The idea was that if someone was innocent, the water, being pure and holy, according to medieval belief, would accept them, allowing them to sink gracefully to the bottom, like a particularly unlucky stone. If they floated, well, clearly they were guilty, because obviously only the devil would allow someone to defy gravity like that. Of course, the main problem with this system is that people have lungs, and when those lungs are filled with air, humans naturally tend to float at least a little bit. So this meant that the vast majority of people tossed into rivers ended up bobbing along the surface, frantically gasping for air while their medieval judges pointed and yelled, "Which? Guilty!" Death sentence. And if the poor soul did sink, proving their innocence, then congratulations, they drowned, but at least their name was cleared. Truly, justice at its finest. Now, if water wasn't available, or someone had already been through too many drowning attempts, trial by fire was next on the list, and if trial by water was ridiculous, trial by fire was outright sadistic. Here, the accused would be forced to either walk across burning hot metal, grab a heated iron rod, or, my personal favorite, shove their entire hand into a cauldron of boiling water and retrieve a specific object, all while pretending they weren't in excruciating agony. Then, once they inevitably suffered third-degree burns, they were told to wait several days while their wounds were monitored. If the burns healed well, congratulations. They were innocent! But if infection set in, flesh started peeling away, or they generally looked like they had just lost a fight with a furnace, well, that was clear evidence that God had abandoned them, meaning they were guilty. And don't even get me started on the fact that medieval medicine was about as effective as waving a stick around while chanting vaguely hopeful phrases, meaning that even the most innocent person would still probably die because burns, shock, and infection were pretty much a guaranteed death sentence back then. And finally, there was trial by combat, which sounds cool and heroic until you realize it was basically just glorified execution disguised as a knightly duel. The principle was simple. 2 people fought, and whoever won was clearly the one favored by divine intervention. If you were accused of something horrible, but happened to be exceptionally good with a sword, then lucky you! You might survive! But if you had 0 combat skills, were in poor health, or, unfortunately for most people, had to face an experienced fighter hired by your accuser, then you were absolutely doomed. Imagine being a frail old merchant accused of fraud, only to be told, "All right, now you must battle this trained knight to prove your innocence." The outcome was not going to be great. In some cases, people could choose a champion to fight for them. But good luck convincing anyone to risk their life for your questionable financial transactions. The loser of the fight was either executed outright, or simply left to die on the battlefield, meaning every legal dispute ultimately became an impromptu medieval UFC match with extra death involved. Shockingly, all these absurd rituals started to fall out of favor as more advanced legal systems developed. Probably because at some point, someone realized that throwing people into rivers or forcing them into a battle to the death wasn't exactly the best way to determine guilt. Eventually, actual courts started relying on investigations, reasoning, and, thankfully, evidence, meaning that trial by ordeal slowly faded into the background as a historical embarrassment. But for centuries, countless people were condemned to horrific fates, not because they were guilty, but because medieval society had decided that suffering was the only way to determine truth. And so, with burnt hands, drowned innocents, and sword-clashed corpses littering history, trial by ordeal became one of the most ridiculous chapters in medieval crime and punishment. Proof that justice was less about finding truth and more about forcing people into impossible situations while pretending it was divine wisdom guiding the way. Sumptuary laws were medieval society's way of making absolutely sure that nobody got too ambitious with their wardrobe choices. Because if there was one thing kings, nobles, and lawmakers all agreed on, it was that fashion needed strict regulation to prevent peasants from looking too fancy and confusing everyone. These laws weren't just mild guidelines or polite suggestions. They were actual, enforceable rules, ensuring that certain colors, fabrics, and styles were reserved exclusively for the upper classes, and anyone caught violating them could be fined, publicly humiliated, or, in some cases, physically punished. In short, medieval rulers wanted a clear visual distinction between classes, because apparently, letting commoners wear velvet or excessively stylish hats was a direct threat to the stability of society. And nothing embodied this ridiculous obsession better than the ban on purple. Because if you thought stepping out in the wrong shade of fabric was a harmless mistake, think again. Wearing purple, if you weren't royalty, could get you in serious trouble, because the color was so heavily associated with wealth and power that it was outright illegal for non-royals to wear it in many places. Imagine the scene. You're a well-off merchant, not noble but successful enough to afford a few luxuries, and you decide to treat yourself to a rich, purple, dyed tunic, because why not? Big mistake. The moment you step into the public square, noble officials or sumptuary law enforcers spot you and immediately determine that your existence is unacceptable. Because if a mere merchant could afford royal colors, then what was stopping everyone else from dressing above their station? Chaos. Clearly. You're dragged into an impromptu punishment session, where you'll either find an absurd amount of money, which is ironic, because you clearly could afford purple in the first place, or publicly humiliated, forced to remove your illegal clothing, or in extreme cases, paraded through the streets as an example of what happens when people start getting fashionably ambitious without noble approval. But fabric choice wasn't the only thing being policed. Sumptuary laws extended to everything from fur trims to the length of shoes, because the medieval ruling class had nothing better to do than panic over the fact that commoners might start dressing with too much confidence. Long-toed shoes, a particular trend among nobles, were strictly regulated because heaven forbid a lower-class citizen has feet that look too expensive. Wearing silk, satin, or anything excessively luxurious could result in immediate fines, forced removal, or a stern lecture from local authorities on why your existence was disruptive to the social hierarchy. And don't even get me started on fur. Certain types were only allowed for certain classes, meaning if a tailor accidentally sold the wrong kind of fur-lined cloak to someone without noble status, that person was essentially walking into an open invitation for punishment. Because apparently, warmth was also a privilege, not a right. Now, you might assume that people simply avoided illegal fashion choices. But of course, the human tendency to ignore absurd rules and test limits meant that violations happened all the time. People would attempt subtle alterations to their clothing, wearing deep reds instead of purple, hoping nobody would notice, or layering silk under a rougher outer garment to disguise its luxury. But law enforcers weren't stupid. They patrolled markets, checked the quality of dyes, examined fabrics, and actively ensured that nobody was secretly dressing like royalty in an attempt to cheat the system. And what about the people who knowingly rebelled against sumptuary laws just to cause chaos? Oh, they existed. Some wealthy merchants and rebellious individuals purposely wore band colors, flaunting luxurious fabrics, just to provoke authorities, and sometimes even bribing law enforcers to look the other way. But for every successful rebellion, there was an unfortunate soul who got caught, fined, or humiliated in front of their entire town, ensuring that everyone else thought twice before attempting to dress above their rank. The worst part: nobles themselves sometimes ignored the laws, and when royalty caught them wearing illegal fashion choices, punishments could be even harsher, because betraying the hierarchy was unacceptable, even at the top. And while nobles could usually weasel their way out of trouble with enough political maneuvering, lower-class citizens had no such luck. If you were caught wearing something you weren't supposed to, you paid the price, no exceptions. Ultimately, sumptuary laws weren't just about clothes, they were about control. They ensured that every class was visually distinct, that nobody accidentally dressed too well and confused the fragile social order, and that wealth was always displayed correctly to remind everyone of their place. They were ridiculous, but they were enforced with terrifying efficiency, making sure that fashion was never just a personal choice. It was a legal obligation, and medieval justice had no patience for trendsetters who ignored the rules. The medieval world was already overflowing with deeply questionable legal practices, but nothing quite captured the sheer madness of baseless accusations, fear-fueled trials, and punishments so absurd they could have been invented by a particularly dramatic playwright like the witchcraft craze of the 15th century. This was the early wave, the prequel to the full-blown witch hysteria of the 16th and 17th centuries, when accusations of cursing cows, summoning storms, and transforming into animals were thrown around as casually as gossip about who had the worst bread-making skills. And at the very center of this chaos, the Valais witch trials of 1428, a terrifyingly efficient mess of paranoia, religious fervor, and good old-fashioned medieval incompetence. Now, witch trials were not new. People had been accusing their neighbors of dabbling in dark magic since the concept of suspicion was invented. But in the 15th century, things escalated dramatically, thanks to a combination of bad weather, political instability, and the general medieval habit of assuming everything was either divine intervention or demonic interference. If crops failed, must be witches. If livestock died, definitely witches. If someone sneezed too aggressively and knocked over a candle, almost burning their house down, absolutely 100% witches. And, as you might have already guessed, proof was never a priority, because in the medieval world, if enough people said something was true, it might as well be fact. Take Valais, a picturesque little region that, in 1428, decided to go on an absolute rampage against supposed witches, fueled by hysteria, political power plays, and a suspicious number of people suddenly eager to blame their misfortunes on convenient scapegoats. What made this particular witch hunt different? The sheer speed at which it operated. It wasn't just a few accused individuals. It was an entire structured purge, with waves of arrests, mass trials, and an execution rate that suggested medieval authorities were really excited to get through their workload efficiently. Within a few months, dozens, possibly hundreds, of people were accused, tortured, and sentenced, many of them on the flimsiest suspicions imaginable. And what were these witches accused of doing? Oh, this is where it gets particularly ridiculous. While later witch hunts focused a lot on satanic pacts and general mystical misbehavior, the early accusations were absolutely wild, ranging from shifting into wolves, because apparently turning into livestock predators was the hottest supernatural trend at the time to summoning storms, because bad weather was obviously too unnatural to happen on its own. Never mind meteorology, someone had to be pulling the strings. One of the strangest accusations. Flying through the air to secret nighttime gatherings. A claim that conveniently aligned with every paranoid authority's worst fears. Because if someone could fly, how were they supposed to be caught? This is why torture existed, apparently. Speaking of torture, the trials themselves were as horrific as they were nonsensical. Forced confessions were the standard, because, shocker, if you tie someone up, stretch them on a rack, and threaten to continue unless they admit to cursing their neighbor's goat, they will absolutely tell you whatever you want to hear. This was never about truth. It was about getting answers that justified further executions. And once someone confessed, names would be demanded, because witches didn't operate alone. according to medieval logic. Every accused person was pressured to reveal accomplices, leading to a chain reaction of more arrests, more trials, and more utterly baffling accusations. And if you're wondering what counted as evidence in these trials, prepare to be severely disappointed. Sometimes it was witness testimony, which was just someone deciding they didn't like their neighbor and conveniently remembering that they had seen them looking suspiciously magical near a field. Sometimes it was birthmarks, because apparently having an oddly shaped mole was a clear sign of demonic activity. And if you didn't have physical proof, no problem. Just claiming someone had unnatural knowledge or was too clever could be enough to put them on trial. And of course, there was no escape. If you denied being a witch, that was suspicious. If you remained calm during interrogation, clearly, you had supernatural resilience. If you panicked, well, that just meant the devil was giving you anxiety. Congratulations. Everything you do is evidence against you. The executions, once the trials inevitably concluded, were brutal and designed to be public warnings. Burning at the stake was a favorite, mostly because fire was believed to purify the soul, though in reality, it was just an extremely dramatic way of making sure no one tried anything rebellious again. Sometimes hanging was involved, but let's be real. When medieval towns decided to purge witches, they wanted maximum spectacle. And the worst part, none of this actually solved anything. The weather didn't magically improve. The crops didn't start thriving overnight, and society didn't become more stable. Instead, all that was achieved was hundreds of deaths, widespread fear, and some very tired executioners who probably needed a break from all the nonsense. Eventually, the hysteria died down, mostly because people started realizing that perhaps mass killing, based on vague suspicions, wasn't the best way to run a town. But the damage had already been done, and this was just the beginning. Because by the time the 16th and 17th centuries rolled around, witch trials would return with even more intensity, accusations evolving into full-blown panic across entire countries. But in the 15th century, this was the warm-up act, a practice run for mass hysteria before things got truly ridiculous. So, if you're lying in bed, listening to all this madness, wondering how on earth people functioned in a world where a bad storm could get you executed, just know, it's over now. You're safe. You can sleep without worrying about getting accused of magic, just because your bread baked unevenly. So, close your eyes. Forget about medieval legal disasters, and for the love of all things historically questionable, go to sleep. Because if you don't, I might just have to start accusing you of suspicious nighttime behavior, and trust me, you do not want to see how medieval law enforcement would handle that. Good night, time traveler. Rest before history gets any worse.